Hey there, ready to dive into a real head scratcher of a problem, one that's been kind of a thorn in the side of AI research for ages. We're talking about the frame problem today. And oh boy, you sent over some really choice excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So let's unpack this thing.
Yeah, it really cuts to the heart of like, what does it even mean to be intelligent, to reason about actions, to understand how things change when we do stuff?
Okay, so imagine this. We're building a robot, but not just any robot. This one is going to be super smart, like it can make a perfect cup of tea. What kind of roadblocks might we hit in trying to make that happen?
Well, at first glance, it seems pretty simple, right? Like just code the steps, boil water, add the tea, let it steep, and boom, done. But underneath that, like lurking beneath that apparent simplicity, is this whole philosophical quagmire. How does our robot buddy know which facts about the world actually matter to its tea-making mission?
That's a really good point. Does it need to be analyzing, the news headlines, the color of the mugs, the weather outside? Where does it draw the line?
Right, exactly. That is the core of the frame problem. How do we, or any intelligence system, represent the effects of what we do without getting completely swamped by like a tidal wave of irrelevant details? It's not just about what changes when we take an action, but also what doesn't change and how to represent all that efficiently.
So it's not enough to program the robot with like the recipe for tea. We also have to give it this, I don't know, common sense ability, right?
Nurturing.
Like knowing what matters in a given context.
Yeah, and that's where it gets super tricky, especially when we start thinking about building AI systems using that like formal logic, the kind of stuff that computers love. Early AI researchers basically ran face first into this wall.
Because logic is so unforgiving, right?
Yeah.
You have to spell everything out. You can't just
Yeah.
assume the system knows, I don't know, that painting a teacup blue won't suddenly make it defy gravity.
Exactly. Like in classical logic, every single thing that doesn't change as a result of an action would have to be explicitly stated. You'd end up with this just insane explosion of axioms, like way too many to even manage.
Okay, so that approach is not going to scale up very well. What did those clever AI folks try next?
Well, they came up with the idea of frame axioms. Think of them like rules,
Yeah.
right? Rules that say, okay, this action over here doesn't affect that property over there. So, like moving the teacup doesn't change its color. That would be a frame axiom.
That sounds kind of clever. Does it actually work, though? I mean, does it solve the problem?
It helps, definitely, but in the end, you're just sort of kicking the can down the road. You're going to need a mountain of these frame axioms to handle even like the simplest scenarios. And it's still not getting at that underlying principle of why certain things stay the same.
I'm starting to see why this is such a tough nut to crack. So what would a more, I don't know, an ideal solution look like?
The holy grail, right, would be to formalize what we call the common sense law of inertia. The idea that, well, things tend to stay put unless something directly acts on them. But getting that intuitive idea into a form that a computer can actually use is, oh man, it's a real beast.
Hmm. I mean, why? It seems so obvious. It's common sense.
Well, here's the thing. Classical logic, which is what a lot of AI systems are built on, it doesn't play nice with exceptions. You see, it's this thing called monotonicity. It's
Right.
like you can't just say this is true unless without throwing a whole wrench in the works, making things really complex logically.
So even something as simple as saying moving a teacup doesn't change its color has these hidden depths because, well, there are exceptions. Like what if you move it right into a bucket of paint?
Bingo! And accounting for all those potential exceptions while keeping your system logically sound, that's a major obstacle.
And that brings us to, I think, the infamous Yale shooting problem, right? It's like a poster child for how even fancier logics can still get tripped up by the frame problem.
You got it. It's this thought experiment that shows really elegantly how tough it is to represent time and the effects of actions in a way that doesn't, lead to logical paradoxes.
Can you maybe walk us through it? I'm sure our listeners are curious to know what this looks like in action.
Okay, picture this. You have a loaded gun, then there's some waiting, like time passes, and then someone fires the gun. Pretty straightforward setup.
Right. You'd expect that the person, whoever they are, gets shot because, well, the gun was loaded.
Yeah, exactly. But early attempts to formalize this, like using a type of logic called non-monotonic logic, which was supposed to be better at handling those unless situations, they ended up with some really strange results. The system couldn't quite grasp that the gun stayed loaded during that waiting period.
So the person wouldn't get shot in these, like, flawed models. That's kind of wild. It seems like even when you try to make the logic smarter, the frame problem can sneak up and bite.
Yeah, it really underscores how hard it is to capture these seemingly basic concepts of cause and effect, especially when time gets thrown into the mix.
This has been a great, I think, breakdown of the logical and computational hurdles of the frame problem. But I know there's this other side to it, right? Something called the epistemological frame problem. What's that all about?
Yeah, so this is where we shift gears a bit. We're moving from the nuts and bolts of logic to the bigger picture of knowledge itself, relevance. It's not just about representing change, it's about how any thinking thing, human or AI, figures out what information is actually important in a given situation.
So it's like when I'm making tea, the color of my socks probably doesn't matter. But if I'm getting dressed for a wedding,
Yeah.
suddenly it's very relevant. How do we or our super smart tea-making robot make those kinds of distinctions?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. Humans, we do this without even thinking about it. But to actually explain that process and then build a system that can do the same, man, that's a profound challenge. It forces us to really look at how we learn, how we know what we know, the foundations of knowledge itself.
This is where it starts to get, I don't know, really mind-bending, right? And I imagine it gets even more tangled when you consider how vast and constantly changing the real world is.
Oh, absolutely. This leads us to what we call the computational aspect of the frame problem. Even if we could crack the code of relevance, how do you actually build it into a system without that system getting totally bogged down by a gazillion calculations?
Right. It's like if our tea-making robot had to think through every possible consequence of every single action, it'd never actually make any tea.
That's the dilemma. We need a system that's smart enough to handle all that complexity, but also efficient enough to, function in real time. It's like walking a tightrope.
Okay, so we've got logic, computation, the nature of knowledge itself, and then we have this whole other layer of weirdness courtesy of philosopher Jerry Fodor and his Phrygian problem, right?
Ah, yes, the Phrygians. Now things are about to get really strange, and that common sense law of inertia, it starts to get a little shaky.
Because now we have these, what are they, these hypothetical particles that only exist when your refrigerator's running.
Exactly. Fodor's point was that this seemingly simple idea of things staying the same unless acted upon hinges on what we decide counts as a thing in the first place.
So if we throw in things like Phrygians, which are linked to these, I don't know, unrelated actions, the whole system kind of falls apart.
It throws a major wrench in the works. Suddenly, turning on your fridge has these massive, unforeseen consequences for the existence of Phrygians. It makes us ask some deep questions about what properties are real enough to be included in our model of the world. In philosophy speak, we're talking about ontology, the study of what exists and how we categorize it.
So our robot might need a philosophy degree on top of its engineering skills just to make a decent cup of tea. This is making my head spin a little, I gotta admit.
It's a lot to take in, definitely, but it really gets at the heart of some fundamental questions about what is intelligence, how do we represent the world, and even what is reality itself.
This has been a fantastic, I think, overview of the frame problem. We've only just dipped our toes in. But it's clear that this problem has these deep philosophical roots and some really far-reaching implications. What stands out to you as the most, I don't know, intriguing or maybe even a little terrifying about this whole conundrum?
What really gets me is that the frame problem isn't just this abstract puzzle for AI folks to solve. It has these huge implications for how we understand our own thinking, our own limitations as humans.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like if AI struggles with this, it makes you wonder how we manage to move through the world so smoothly. What are your thoughts on that?
To me, it points to the idea that intelligence, real intelligence, isn't just about logic or raw processing power. There's this intuitive grasp of what's relevant, this ability to filter out the noise and zero in on what matters. And we haven't figured out how to build that into AI systems yet.
Maybe that's what makes us us, right? That human adaptability. This is giving me a lot to think about.
And we've only just begun. We've laid the foundation, but there's so much more to unearth.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate all the work our brains are doing, behind the scenes all the time.
Absolutely. We're out here making decisions, taking actions, and we don't even have to consciously think about this whole relevance thing. It's just, intuitive. And that brings us to, I think, a really key insight. The frame problem, it's not just a challenge for AI, it's also a really powerful tool for understanding, human cognition, how our own minds work.
Oh, how so? I'm curious.
Well, think about it this way. The frame problem forces us to admit that even us, even with our big human brains, we can't possibly consider every single detail when we're making a decision. We just don't have the mental bandwidth.
So in a way, it's saying that human rationality, it has limits, right? Like some philosophers call it bounded rationality. We can only process so much information at once.
Exactly. And that has some pretty big implications for fields like psychology, economics, even political science, right? It challenges that classic view of humans as these perfectly rational beings.
It's kind of humbling, you know. It reminds us that we're not these perfect logical machines. We rely on these shortcuts, on our gut feelings to navigate a world that's just too complex to really fully grasp.
Yeah. Right. And it opens up these whole new avenues for research. Like, if we can understand better the specific ways that human rationality is limited, then maybe we can design better systems, better institutions that take those limits into account, you know?
So the frame problem, it's not just about making AI smarter. It's also about us becoming more aware of our own biases,
Mm.
our blind spots, right? It's
Yeah.
about understanding what it means to be human, you know?
It reminds us that intelligence, whether it's ours or a machine's, it's not just about processing power, right? It's about knowing what deserves our attention, what we can safely ignore, and how to make sense of a world that's always changing.
You know, this whole conversation is making me think about those optical illusions. The ones where you see one thing and then suddenly your perception shifts and you see something completely different. Is it possible that the frame problem is like a cognitive illusion? We think we're seeing the whole picture, but our brains are always making choices about what to focus on and what to tune out.
Wow, that's a great analogy. And it really speaks to the idea that our perception of reality is always, to some degree, constructed, right? We're not just passive observers, we're actively shaping how we understand the world.
Mind-blowing. So we've been talking about the big philosophical implications, but I'd love to hear more about, the practical side. What kind of progress has actually been made in tackling the frame problem, especially within AI research?
Well, as I mentioned before, classical AI has had some success in specific areas, limited domains. In those controlled environments, you can lay down the rules very clearly, limit the number of things the system has to deal with.
So like our tea-making robot from earlier.
Yeah.
If we really nail down its task, its environment, we can create a system that makes tea without having an existential crisis about the nature of reality, right?
Exactly. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. There are other more sophisticated approaches out there that try to address the frame problem head on. For example, some researchers are looking at probabilistic reasoning as a way to handle, uncertainty and exceptions.
So instead of trying to account for every possible scenario, you assign probabilities to different outcomes, like what's most likely to happen based on the information you have.
Precisely. It's a way of acknowledging that we can never have perfect knowledge, but we can still make reasonable guesses, you know, based on the evidence.
That seems a lot more, I don't know, flexible, adaptable. What about those non-monotonic logics we talked about before?
Yeah.
Have those made any headway in tackling the frame problem?
They've definitely helped us understand the problem better, but they haven't quite turned out to be the magic bullet solution some people hoped for.
Because they still run into those weird edge cases like the Yale shooting problem. And maybe because they get, like, computationally expensive when you're dealing with real-world complexity.
Yeah, those are some of the hurdles, but the research in non-monotonic logic is ongoing, and there are some interesting things happening in areas like defeasible reasoning and argumentation logic. Those try to model how humans, reason when we have incomplete information, or when the information conflicts.
So it's a dynamic field, right? Researchers trying out all sorts of approaches to crack this really tough problem. It's fascinating how the philosophy and the technical stuff are so intertwined here.
It's a perfect illustration of how philosophical questions can drive scientific and technological progress.
And the other way around. Like, the more we try to build AI, the more we learn about our own minds.
It reminds us that intelligence in any form, it's a journey, it's about discovery. It's not about reaching a final destination. It's about constantly seeking a deeper understanding.
This has been so insightful, truly. And I think it's safe to say that the frame problem, the more you learn about it, the more you realize how much more there is to learn.
It's like you're looking into this philosophical abyss.
You're right.
A little daunting, maybe, but also really exciting.
So as we wrap up this part of our exploration, I want to encourage our listeners to just sit with these ideas for a bit. What are your thoughts on the frame problem? What does it say about AI, about philosophy, about us as thinking beings?
Don't be afraid to lean into the mystery, you know? Sometimes the most profound questions are the ones that don't have easy answers.
I love that. It's about the journey, not the destination. Let's dive into the final part of this deep dive after a quick message. And we're back, ready to ready to jump back into the deep end of the frame problem. This is one of those topics that really makes you step back and think about, like, what is knowledge? What does it mean to be intelligent? And maybe even, like, what is reality itself?
Yeah, and what I find so fascinating is how it highlights all these things we do without even thinking about it, in our everyday thinking.
Right.
Like we just naturally zero in on what's relevant, what's important, without ever consciously recognizing all the complex cognitive machinery that's going on under the hood.
It really is like our brains have this incredibly sophisticated filter, right?
Mm,
Constantly sorting through this torrent of information and somehow managing to pick out the signal from all the noise.
yeah.
But the big question is how? How do they do it? That's the heart of this mystery.
And it's a mystery that has these huge, I think, implications, not just for AI research, but also for how we understand ourselves, how we make decisions, how we interact with the world, everything.
I'm also struck by the ethical dimension of all this. Like if we're actually trying to build AI systems that can make choices in the real world, choices that could really impact people's lives, then this whole relevance problem becomes even more crucial, right?
Mm.
How do we make sure that these systems are making judgments that align with our values, with what we consider right and wrong?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that ethicists and philosophers are really wrestling with right now, especially as AI becomes more sophisticated, more integrated into our daily lives. We have to think carefully about how we design these systems so that they're not just intelligent, but also responsible, accountable, and aligned with our ethical principles.
So it's not just about creating AI that can think, it's about AI that can think well, that can think ethically. That adds a whole other level of complexity to this already incredibly complex problem.
It does, and it highlights the need for, I think, a lot more collaboration between different fields. We need
Yeah.
computer scientists working hand in hand with ethicists, philosophers, psychologists, social scientists, everyone really, to ensure that the AI we create is truly beneficial for humanity.
It's a good reminder that technology, it's never neutral. It always reflects the values and the goals of the people who make it. And as we move into this uncharted territory of artificial intelligence, it's more important than ever to have these conversations, to think critically about the potential consequences of what we're creating.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not just about avoiding potential harms. It's also about using AI's power for good. Like, imagine if we could solve the frame problem. If we could create AI that understands and responds to the world with the same kind of nuance and flexibility as humans. The possibilities are pretty amazing.
It's almost overwhelming to think about, right? We could have AI helping us tackle some of the world's biggest challenges, like climate change, poverty, disease. But it all hinges on getting this relevance thing right, on building AI that not only thinks, but thinks ethically and acts responsibly.
It's a huge challenge, absolutely, but it's also an incredibly exciting time to be involved in this field. There's a sense that we're on the verge of something truly transformative, something that could completely change what it means to be human.
It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, that quest to understand ourselves and the world around us, it never really ends. And the frame problem, with all its complexities and challenges, is like a perfect example of a question that can take us down these fascinating paths of discovery.
Yeah, it forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to push beyond what we thought was possible, and who knows what incredible insights we might find along the way, right?
So for our listeners out there who are really interested in digging deeper into the frame problem, where would you point them? What are some books, articles, thinkers that you'd recommend checking out?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article we've been talking about is a great place to start. It gives you a really thorough overview of the problem, its history, and it links to a ton of other resources. And for those who are intrigued by Fodor's ideas about phrygians and the whole, ontology problem, his book, LT2, The Language of Thought Revisited, is definitely worth a read.
It's a challenging read, but it's full of thought-provoking ideas about how our minds represent the world. And for those who want to explore the frame problem from a less symbolic, more embodied perspective, the work of Rodney Brooks and what's called the situated robotics movement is really interesting.
Brooks argued that intelligence doesn't necessarily require these complex internal representations of the world. His robots, which had these simple reactive behaviors, showed that you could actually achieve a surprising level of intelligence just through direct interaction with the environment.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions can be the most elegant. And for those interested in the connection between AI and how our brains actually work, I'd recommend checking out the work of Walter Freeman, who studied the dynamics of brain activity and argued that intelligence comes from the complex interactions between neurons, networks, and the environment.
Freeman's research offers a really interesting alternative to that traditional view of the brain as a computer. It reminds us that intelligence isn't just about computation, it's about the dynamic interplay between biology and the environment.
This has been such a stimulating conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of the frame problem,
Yeah.
but I have a much better understanding now of its importance and its implications.
It's a problem that will keep us busy for a long time, I think. And as AI keeps evolving, it'll be even more crucial to grapple with these fundamental questions about what is intelligence, what is relevance, and what are the limits of what we can know.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the frame problem, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Don't be afraid to embrace the unknown. Don't shy away from the big questions, even if they seem overwhelming or impossible to answer. Because it's in those moments of uncertainty, when we're wrestling with what we don't know, that we really expand our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Yeah, the frame problem is a perfect example of a question that can lead us down these unexpected and really illuminating paths. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep diving deep into the mysteries of the universe.
Beautifully said. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder the mysteries of the frame problem. Until next time, stay curious and keep those questions coming.